This week on the Lectures in History podcast, when Hawaii became the 50th state in 1959, it marked a turning point not just in American expansion, but in the preservation of a unique cultural identity. Gonzaga University professor Veta Schlimgen chronicles Hawaii's path from an independent kingdom to U.S. territory and eventually statehood, examining how Native Hawaiian traditions, language, and political activism endured through decades of change. From the overthrow of Queen Leleokalani in 1893 to the statehood vote in the mid-20th century, Professor Schlimgen explores the tensions between American governance and indigenous sovereignty and how cultural revival movements helped ensure that Hawaii's history did not disappear into the broader American story. More after this.
Okay, the question we're going to address today, how did Hawaiians recover traditions and practices, is one that fits really nicely with the context that we've been looking at and the history we've been examining. So my preliminary argument is that Hawaiians recovered traditions and practices at a specific time and for very necessary reasons. And I'll give you details on how that came about. We're going to start by identifying when, how, and why they did this. So the when is that they began to recover practices in the 1960s. They did this by tapping into the knowledge of elders. And most of these elders were Hawaiian, but not all of them were Hawaiian. And the why is many reasons. So among those many reasons are that Hawaiian tradition, culture, and language were disappearing. And the population of non-native Hawaiians, people who were not Kanaka Maoli, they were decreasing on the island, proportionate to the other residents. The other thing that we already know about is the anti-colonial movements that were happening throughout the Pacific. This decolonization effort was a way to not only rid Pacific Islands of colonialism, but to push back against the idea that they represented whoever their colonizers were. And so that was also taking place in Hawaii. The result was an effort to regain knowledge, preserve tradition, and reclaim Hawaiian land for Kanaka Maoli. So we're going to look at those details first by situating them within their context. So in 1962, Western Samoa gained its independence. This was the first Pacific nation to emerge as an independent state in the post-World War II period. And this was symbolic of the era of independence, something that people had struggled for decades. The Hawaiian recovery of traditions and practices is something that occurred within this larger context of independent struggles that were happening throughout the Pacific. I've argued that there is a sense of affinity between Kanaka Maoli and other people who lived in the Pacific region and under colonial powers. So in this case, what we see happening in the 1960s with Native Hawaiians is that they're not gaining independence, but they are trying to push back against the assimilation imposed on them by colonizers. They work to recover pre-contact practices and traditions. And so in this respect, Native Hawaiians were a part of a larger Pacific-wide movement, even though they didn't gain independence. And the first example that I'm going to start with, the first bit of evidence, is the one that they engaged in to try to recover knowledge of seafaring, voyaging, navigation, and wayfinding. And the reason that this is a catalyst for Kanaka Maoli is because of a debate that erupted during and after World War II. So the question that prompted this debate was, how did the people of the Pacific get to the islands where they lived? And one hypothesis offered by Thor Heyerdahl, who's in the bottom right here, he argued that they sailed there from South America. So basically his argument was that everyone in the Pacific region, they were descendants of South American indigenous people. And to do this, he decided to reconstruct a voyaging raft. And that's what you see behind him, Kontiki. So he went into the archives, he examined sources that the Spanish had collected during colonization, and he recreated what was really a raft, because there's no sail on that ship. And he sailed it from South America out to French Polynesia, and he said, there, now we know how people got into the Pacific. And not everyone was convinced, but one of the individuals who was absolutely opposed to Heyerdahl was Andrew Sharp, who you see in the center photograph there. Andrew Sharp said that is absolutely not possible. There's no way that these people sailed out to the islands. He said what actually happened was they accidentally drifted there. So what this means, what he argued, Sharp argued, was that an accidental process occurred through which a fortuitous series of unintended drift voyages and randomly directed exile voyages, that's how people got to the Pacific. Sharp said that Polynesians didn't have the means to sail out to distant and unknown islands, and once having discovered them, to go back to their origins, load up canoes with all the supplies that they would need for creating a new settlement, and then go out to that island again. So both of these guys proposed very different theories for how people came into the Pacific, and both of them were flat wrong. Because both of these theories are premised on the idea that Pacific people were too primitive and they could not achieve any technological knowledge that Europeans didn't have at the time. This was a debate that was happening mostly among Europeans and their descendants in the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. And this is where Native Hawaiian knowledge became really crucial. So people all over the world were debating the question about how did the peopling of the Pacific happen, and Kanaka knew the answer. One of the key figures in this is Mary Kawena Pukui. She is regarded as perhaps the foremost scholar of Hawaiian history, language, and culture in the 20th century. She was born in 1895, so she was born after the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy, but before the annexation. And as a teenager, she began to translate and transcribe Hawaiian history genealogy, the mo'oko'auhau that we talked about so many weeks ago. She also recorded Hawaiian myths, legends, music. She wrote about hula, medicine, and midwifery. Pukui finished high school, but she did not go any further in her education because the thing that she was passionate about, the thing that she studied, Hawaiian history, was something that was not offered at any college or university at the time. Instead, Pukui got a job at the Bishop Museum in Honolulu that collects a lot of materials that are related to Hawaiian history and culture. And so during the 1950s, when Pukui was working at the Bishop Museum and most residents of Hawaii, including Kanaka Maoli, were losing a knowledge of Hawaiian language and culture, Pukui was going the other direction. She was documenting the language, she was recording spoken traditions, she was writing it down, and she was translating Hawaiian histories and myths and legends into English. For example, her recording of Hawaiian history and language includes a dictionary. She edited and compiled a dictionary, and this helped modern speakers figure out how to pronounce Hawaiian words, especially since the number of Hawaiian speakers in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s was declining. And so as they died, no one knew how to say the words that she was writing down, but she had audio recordings. So Pukui, because of the research she did, she knew a lot about kahiki. And she knew that Hawaiians had come from kahiki. And so she definitely thought there was some absurdity to the Sharp and Heyerdahl debate, but she also had a lot of information, a lot of knowledge to provide to both that debate, but also to other people who were living in the new state of Hawaii. And so she collaborated with Kanaka, with Asian Americans, with white Americans to challenge these theories. This was an uphill battle, though, because of the cultivated bigotry that held that all people in the Pacific were lovely to look at, but they were primitive, ignorant, and just simple-minded. So their effort was two-pronged: to demonstrate the technological achievements of Hawaiians prior to European contact and to expose the bigoted views of many people that they had of indigenous Hawaiians and other Pacifica people more broadly. So the way that they did that was to use her information, use the materials, the knowledge that she had compiled. And so they came together, this is Kanaka Maoli, Asian Americans, white allies, and they tried to recreate the voyaging canoes that they knew about, that they had read about in the sources. The earliest effort was to build a double-hulled canoe that could sail among the Hawaiian islands, and they were successful. They did this in 1966. They built a double-hulled canoe where they could sail it among the Hawaiian islands. there were so many people who were excited about this process that they came together, and in 1973, they formed the Polynesian Voyaging Society. This was an organization oriented around recovering voyaging and seafaring knowledge. The document that I gave you for today describes this group and the recovery of knowledge, and that they had to learn the history in order to try it out on the water, to experiment with what they were reading in these sources. There was one crucial element of the building of canoes that Hawaiians were not finding as readily in their sources. It was something they couldn't construct, and that was wayfinding. And we talked about wayfinding weeks ago. We talked about wayfinding. The iteration that we talked about was ancient wayfinding. And wayfinding, you'll recall, is the way that someone who is sailing uses the stars, the sun, the moon, the motion of the sea, the currents and wind, as well as signs from birds and sea life in order to intentionally navigate long voyages across the open ocean. Micronesians had retained this knowledge to navigate in the Western Pacific. And part of my theory about why Micronesians retained this knowledge where Hawaiians didn't is that Hawaiian islands, as you see on the right, they are very high profile. There's no way, if you're on a canoe, that you will miss them. You will see these islands. They're also very close together. But Micronesian islands are low-lying atolls, and they are spread out, as we looked at last week, over a geographic scope that is roughly equivalent to the North American US. So that is a lot of space with a lot of low-lying islands that you have to know where they are if you're going to sail between them. So Micronesians retained this knowledge, and the Polynesian Voyaging Society made contact with and incorporated one navigational expert into their group, Maupiailog. He had learned navigational knowledge from his home in Sawatal and Yap State in Micronesia, and he learned it from his family and from other expert navigators. So he was the navigator that the Polynesian Voyaging Society incorporated to teach them how to wayfind in the modern era. And so what we see happening is that wayfinding gets a modern renewal because of the Polynesian Voyaging Society and because of people like Maupiailog. You'll recall too that wayfinding is something that is in the head of the navigator. There are no maps. So these experts have to know how to navigate before they get on the canoes. So they have their navigator, they have their ships, and they decide to try a long-distance ocean voyage in 1976 using the Hokule'a. Does anybody recall from the reading what the Hokule'a was? Does anybody want to say anything about it? Go ahead.
It was named after Arcturus, the star.
Yeah, the brightest star in the sky, and it was the star that navigators would look for if they were heading to Hawaii. That once you got Arcturus right above you, you head west and you hit Hawaii. There's no way to miss it. So that is how Hokule'a got its name, the first ocean-going double-hulled canoe. This was 61 feet long. This is intended for long ocean voyages where the inter-island canoes are like 40 feet long. And in March of 1976, they decided to sail for Tahiti to recreate those ancient voyages that they had taken between Hawaii and Tahiti in order to originally populate the Hawaiian Islands. So it took them just over a month sailing on Hokule'a, and when they arrived in Tahiti and Papeete Harbor, over 17,000 people turned out to see it. That was more than half the population of the island at the time. So this gives us some sense of the incredible excitement. There was not just among Hawaiians, but among Tahitians as well. One of the navigators on the Hokule'a, he said about the arrival, "The canoe came in and touched the beach. There was an immediate response of excitement by everybody, including the children. Oh, so many children got onto the canoe, they sank the stern. We were politely trying to get them off the rigging and everything else just for the safety of the canoe. So there was so much excitement that they almost sank the canoe because there was such a crowd around it. This was a thrilling achievement. It proved all those naysayers wrong. It proved the expertise of Pacifica canoe builders, of voyaging, of wayfinding. It proved that Pacific people had intentionally populated the entire region and that they maintained connections between different island groups over the course of generations. This was a greater technology than Europeans had at the time, and so it was confrontational in that respect. One of the sailors and navigators, Nainoa Thompson, explained why the Hokule'a mattered, not just to Kanaka, not just to Native Hawaiians and to Tahitians, but also to Micronesians and other Pacifica following colonization.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
He said, "We lost all that we knew about our traditions, and it's going to be through research and through projects like this that we can regain it. But we're not just regaining an artifact. We are regaining the pride and a culture of a people, a proud, courageous people." The achievement of Hokule'a would not have been possible without the work of people like Mary Kawena Pukui, who mastered, preserved, and taught Hawaiian language. And so that brings me to something else I assigned you for today, the podcast. I think it did a fabulous job presenting the significance of the recovery of the Hawaiian language, and it was a long and difficult process. So I'm curious if you have any comments or observations, but the one question I wanted to ask is, what was the thing that Larry Kimura said had to happen in order to recover a dying language like the Hawaiian language? What needed to happen?
There needs to be some people who actually are trying to get it back.
Yeah, there needs to be some enthusiasm behind the effort. They need to want to try to recover the language. That's a key piece. Anything else? Yeah, go ahead.
Need native-born speakers.
Yeah, you need native-born speakers, and like Pukui, they were few. Larry Kimura provides us with a great example of how someone who was born speaking English, so that was his first language, how he could recover Hawaiian and become a speaker. Any other pieces? There's one other piece. Well, actually, I think there's two. So Larry Kimura, he said, one of the key things that has to happen, you have to have interest, you have to have people who want to do it, you have to have native speakers so that you can learn how to pronounce things. You have to have schools. You have to start young, and one of his proudest achievements was finding a nursery school that was in Hawaiian, so that children would have Hawaiian as their first language, rather than English as their first language and Hawaiian as their learned language. But one of the other things that this story conveys is the significance of having families speak Hawaiian, so that they are always speaking Hawaiian at school and at home. And you see that in the school, how they're training the parents and the grandparents so that they can speak Hawaiian with the kids who are enrolled in these schools. The significance of this achievement, the preschool and the fact that there are now generations of people in Hawaii for the first time who speak Hawaii from childhood as their first language. So this is significant not only for cultural preservation and the pride of Hawaiians, but it's also significant to us. And here's why. We have a better understanding of Hawaiian history and perspectives today, in this year, because of the language recovery that happened in the 1970s and 1980s. The recovery of the Hawaiian language has allowed Hawaiian scholars who read and speak Hawaiian to gain access to sources that no one has read for a century. And one example of this is Noenoe Silva. She's a political scientist, and she was someone who pushed back against this narrative that Americans held for a long time, that Hawaiians, Native Hawaiians, were pretty much indifferent to annexation by the United States, or that they supported becoming a part of the US. Noenoe Silva went into the National Archives and she found petitions with hundreds and thousands of signatures, petitions by Native Hawaiians from the 1890s where they had signed to say, please, U.S. Congress, do not annex our kingdom, do not appropriate our land and our territory. They gave those petitions to Queen Liliuokalani. She brought them to Congress. So she presented them to Congress, which is how they end up in the National Archives. But because so many scholars, so many people had lost the ability to speak and understand Hawaiian, that piece of U.S. history had been lost until she recovered it. And she was able to recover it because she spoke and she could read Hawaiian. So this example, I think, demonstrates how we all benefit from the revival of the Hawaiian language. Starting in the year 2000, there have been many, many more wonderful histories of Hawaii, and they're writings that provide perspective to those of us who are not Hawaiian. They help us learn and understand not only Hawaiian history, but U.S. history better because of their access to those sources. So we all benefit in the end. The last couple of examples I have for you are about dispossession and about the effort by Native Hawaiians to try to regain control of land. And this aligns with the anti-colonial movements we've been talking about, because even though Hawaiians were not overwhelmingly seeking independence at this point, they were seeking to recover and gain control over land for Native Hawaiians. So the first example I have for you, it comes from the island of Oahu, and it has to do with the Kalama Valley. So the Kalama Valley is on that southern tip of Oahu. And in 1968, the Bishop Trust, which owned a lot of land in the Kalama Valley, decided to lease 800 acres of this land to developers. They wanted to build shopping malls, luxury houses, high-rise apartments, golf courses, and this was to respond to the increasing population pressures, because people who had gone to Hawaii as tourists, they loved the place, they decided they wanted to move there or to buy a second home there. And so there was an increasing population pressure and a desire for these types of homes and apartments. So the Bishop Trust, the people who oversaw the trust, they said, sure, we're gonna lease you 800 acres so you can build all of these houses. And there was a lot of protest over this because Bernice Bishop, who you see in the center there, she was among Hawaiian royalty prior to the overthrow of the kingdom. Bernice Bishop, she was someone who had a lot of property and she had no children. So when she died in 1884, she took the property and put it in trust. That's where the Bishop Trust comes from. And she said, the trustees of this land will make money off of it and they will use that money to educate Native Hawaiians in perpetuity. And so that's what the trustees were doing. And they thought that they were doing something that would earn money by leasing out this land in the Kalama Valley for development. But their problem was that the Kalama Valley was already inhabited. So there were a lot of people already living in the Kalama Valley. Many of them were not affluent. Many of them were Native Hawaiian. And they didn't want to be removed from their homes. So they started to protest under the banner Kokua Kalama, Save Kalama or Help Kalama. They were evicted from their homes, then they would come back after the evictions. They were arrested for trespassing, now in places where they shouldn't have been. And this went on and on. The Kokua Kalama organizers decided to start tours of the valley. So some of the tourists who would come to Hawaii, they wanted to give them a tour of this valley on Oahu. And they gave them tours of the Kalama Valley in order to try to convey that there were deep problems in Hawaii, that Native Hawaiians were losing access to land as a result of development that came about because of tourism. In October of 1970, they rallied at the state capitol. That's what you see in the bottom there. They argued that the trustees of the Bishop Trust had violated that trust because the Bishop Trust trustees, so the people who are in charge of making decisions, that they were deciding that this land should be used for development for people who were not Hawaiian, rather than as residences for people who were Hawaiian. Ultimately, they failed. And this is what the Kalama Valley looks like today. As the development moved forward, Native Hawaiians said, this is further evidence of dispossession, that U.S. colonialism continued to impact them, to degrade their lives, because it removed them from places that had been their homes for generations. Despite the failure of the effort to save the Kalama Valley, this did inspire a lot of Native Hawaiians and their Asian American and white allies. And so what happened in Kalama Valley, this example of dispossession does not end there. And that dovetails then with the next example that I have for you that comes from, so Oahu is here and Kaho'olawe is here. So Kaho'olawe is off the southwest coast of Maui. And the loss of Kalama Valley informed the activism around Kaho'olawe. The effort to reassert control over Kaho'olawe started in the 1970s, and it started because this was an island that the Navy used for testing, to drop bombs, to see how good their aviators were, to see how accurate they could fire bombs, missiles from ships. And by the 1970s, Kaho'olawe had the reputation as the most bombed island in the entire Pacific. And that's what I've got in the picture here. If you can see the ship off the coast and the massive explosion. It's one of many pictures of the bombardment of Kaho'olawe as a training ground. So the entire island was a military zone, and it was uninhabited because of that, because it was a testing site. So the activists who had not achieved their goals in Kalama Valley, they refocused on Kaho'olawe in 1976. They started to visit the island because it was within, you can see it from the coast of Maui. It was close enough that it was not so hard to visit. In fact, one of the explosions on Kaho'olawe, it damaged property on Maui, and that is part of why the effort I'm going to tell you about garnered so much support, is because people who were living on Maui were tired of having their windows rattle and shake every time the Navy was bombarding Kaho'olawe. So the visits to Kaho'olawe proved productive. On Kaho'olawe, they found petroglyphs, they found evidence of sacred sites from pre-contact Hawaii. Some of the sources that they uncovered, because again, they have access to all these sources that Mary Pukui had retained, had saved. They knew that Kaho'olawe was the island where his Hawaiian wayfinders went to learn how to navigate the ocean. And so because now they have the success of Hokule'a under their belts, they see Kaho'olawe as a very different place. So Kaho'olawe became a symbol of the theft and dispossession of Hawaiian lands by the U.S. and their desecration by the U.S. military. And this animated the movement to reclaim Kaho'olawe. They used evidence of the bombing to try to dislodge the Navy and reclaim the island. The plan on the part of Hawaiian activists was to demilitarize the island, recover sacred sites, and begin the process of stewardship by replanting the land and cultivating the sea. So Hawaiians and their supporters went through a protracted struggle with the U.S. Navy for Kaho'olawe. They demonstrated, they sued the Navy, they sued the national government in order to try to regain access to Kaho'olawe. I'm going to keep it here for a second. The Navy disagreed. In one of the statements to the court, the Navy claimed that what they were doing on Kaho'olawe was really beneficial to the environment. They had to submit an environmental impact statement, and the Navy said that blowing up all of these bombs aerated the land. So they should retain possession of Kaho'olawe because they were doing some great stuff there. Ultimately, what happens in Kaho'olawe is that through sustained activism, sustained opposition, and a sustained effort to reclaim Kaho'olawe, in 1990, the U.S. government gave Kaho'olawe back to the state of Hawaii. So it had been federal territory. They give the island to the state, and the state in 1994, they gave it to the Native Hawaiian people who live in the state of Hawaii. And they established the Kaho'olawe Island Preserve. It is currently under the stewardship of Kanaka Maoli people who live in Hawaii, and it will belong to them once the state and federal government recognize Kanaka as a sovereign people. So that gets me to my conclusion. All of this evidence, all of these stories, and what they tell us about the recovery of Hawaiian traditions is that Native Hawaiians have worked hard over the past 2 generations to relearn their language, to recover their stories and their histories, to understand traditions that they almost lost in the mid-20th century. They did this in conjunction with Pacifica people throughout the oceanic region. Some of them lived in newly independent states, and some of them continued to live in colonies. So Maupiailug, who was Micronesian, is one example of those allies.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
The other thing that these stories tell us is how Native Hawaiians engaged in a rights movement. This is something similar to the rights movements of Asian Americans, African Americans, Latine Americans. And so in this respect, what they are doing fits with what we have been examining in this class, how there are many different rights movements that happened in the 60s and 70s. But there is a significant difference with Native Hawaiian activism that is important to point out at this point. Because Kanaka Maoli, they didn't just push back against the discrimination that they had faced for generations. They also fought to recover traditions and restore the people, land, and resources of the Hawaiian Islands. They wanted recognition of Native Hawaiians as a sovereign people who lived under the United States. And so there's a very important difference here in the needs of a racial minority, which is the case for Asian American activists that we've been examining. But there are different needs for colonized people who live in their homeland. And so that is a contrast that we'll continue to explore. I wanted to ask you if you have questions about the argument that I've offered, the evidence I provided you with, or comments about the readings that I gave you for today. Yes, please.
Do you think that the building of the TNT on the Mauna Kea is a good partnership? I know they're trying to build it, but also give back to the community. But it's still a huge problem using a place of huge spiritual value.
Yeah, so the 30-meter telescope on Mauna Kea, which we will talk about in a few weeks, is something that continues to be a point of strife that comes out of these movements. So it's a great example, and I'm really glad you mentioned it. The 30-meter telescope will build a state-of-the-art telescope on the highest peak in the Hawaiian Islands. But Native Hawaiians and their allies point out that this is sacred territory and that they have given up a lot already. They've given a lot to the state of Hawaii, to scholarly research, to scientific innovation, and they are ready to have their desires recognized. And in the material that I've read, I have not seen that they've found a point of rest, I guess, the equilibrium between what scientists want and what Native Hawaiians want. And so, no. My short answer to your question is no. They have not yet identified a good compromise between the effort to try to build this telescope and acknowledging what Native Hawaiians need, what they want, and how they want to reclaim the sacred space of Mauna Kea. Yeah.
I know that, the people building it they're trying to go to schools and still give back to the community, but is that a good enough trade-off for the sacred land that they are taking? But at least they are trying to give back where many developers haven't.
They are trying to give back. I am not the expert to ask. As a person who is not Native Hawaiian, I rely on the sources that Native Hawaiians produce. And the sources that I've seen still show that Native Hawaiians, not all of them, granted there's lots of different opinions among Native Hawaiians, but they have not yet accepted the argument that the 30-meter telescope on Mauna Kea is necessary. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Wait, where do you get the Hawaiian sources?
Where do the Hawaiian sources come from?
Yeah.
The Hawaiian sources come from a variety of different areas. So one of the pieces of information I gave you at the beginning of the semester, the one, I think it was on genealogy and moku'auhau, that came from this massive compendium published by the Bishop Museum that brought together a lot of Native Hawaiian sources. Some of the other sources I've used are from Mary Kawena Pukui. So she published a lot of books that are still available today. And then I used a lot of the scholarship that I showed you when I was talking about language. So all of those things inform the story that I put together. Others? Yeah.
We talked about the myth and legends book that the king wrote.
Yeah.
Was that translated by the person we talked about today?
I think that he published that in English. So he did that. I mean, it's a great illustration of his expertise in English. And the myths and legends published by King Kalakaua. So that was something that, it was his initiative, but it also creates this indelible record of Hawaiian beliefs and traditions. And it's a great resource that Mary Pukui definitely used, but so do other people who want to know more about Hawaiian history. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, then I'm all done. Thank you very much. I'll see you on Wednesday and we'll talk about Marshallese environmentalists.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
To find more of our history programming, visit our website at sea-span.org.